Hello and welcome to another episode of October Surprise, a podcast created for citizens by citizens in Pennsylvania's new 16th Congressional District. I'm Jim Wertz, a lifelong resident of Northwest Pennsylvania and your host for today's podcast. A little bit of background on our podcast. October Surprise features a series of interviews designed to educate listeners in Erie, Crawford, Mercer, Lawrence, and Butler counties on key issues that face both our district and our two congressional candidates, incumbent Mike Kelly and challenger Ron DiNicola. On each podcast, we'll also discuss ethical leadership, which unfortunately is in rare supply in Washington, D.C. in 2018. We'll do a lot of talking today and throughout the month of October on this podcast, but our ultimate goal is action. For democracy to work, you have to participate. We can't be bystanders. So at a minimum, that means being an informed voter, and you're taking the first step by listening to this podcast today. You can take another step by sharing episodes of October Surprise with your family and at least one or two friends, those on-the-fence voters who live in our district. The ultimate action is to vote on Election Day. Let's surprise the special interest groups, the political action committees, and the big money when we take back our district on Tuesday, November 6th, and once again, put people first. And finally, I have to say, I'm not a political veteran or a campaign strategist. I don't have all the answers. But together, we're going to learn what's happening in our district by talking with elected officials, grassroots leaders, and extraordinary citizens from PA 16 in each episode. Our special guest today is Jim Wertz. He was recently elected Erie County Democratic Chairman. He's also an active volunteer with the Erie Philharmonic, Luther Memorial School, and Ignite Erie, which is a group that promotes economic empowerment in Northwest Pennsylvania. He's also a contributing editor to the Erie Reader and an associate dean and associate professor of broadcast journalism and digital media at Edinburgh University. Thanks for your time today, Jim. Welcome to October Surprise.
Thanks, Jim. I'm glad to be here.
Great. And I have to say, I do feel a little bit pressure talking to somebody who's an expert in broadcast journalism and digital media, and here we are doing that exact thing. So you can give me a critique at the end of our podcast, okay?
I'll get feedback, but no grade. How about that?
That would be outstanding. Yes, I have to pay tuition to get the grade from you.
That's right.
And we'll do that critique after I stop hitting record, so everybody doesn't have to hear where I need to get better.
Fair enough.
So you're the Erie County Democratic Chairman, but to frame up this discussion, we're not going to focus on the Democratic Party, or this isn't going to be some anti-Republican rant. I mean, I don't think Americans and Pennsylvanians benefit when elected officials place their parties before the good of the people. So let's talk about something that impacts everybody who's listening to this, local economic development. So I mentioned you're part of Ignite Erie, so that's a group that brought together 350 entrepreneurs, educators, policymakers, elected officials to discuss the future of inner-city investment and innovation-based economic development in our area. So can you give a broad picture of what's the economic future of Northwest PA and of our 16th Congressional District?
Sure. Well, Northwest PA as a whole has really had a slowing economy over the past 15 years, well, really since 2000. Economic growth is not where we would like it to be, and to give you a comparison, the United States since 2000 has seen real gross domestic product growth of about 28%. Here in Erie, we've only had about 1% growth in the local economy. And so we'd really like to see that economy begin to become a bit more robust. And I think part of that is going to be the way that we diversify our portfolio, our industrial portfolio in the future. Manufacturing still accounts for 22% of the local economy. It is still our largest output. That's great, but it makes us largely dependent on the whims of manufacturing in both the national and international economies. And when you have a large employer who is also kind of the bedrock of that manufacturing industry in the local economy, it becomes a grave concern. So we would like to see, I think, from kind of an economic standpoint, just a greater diversity of contributions to the local economy. We see a lot of growth in healthcare and in social assistance. It's our second largest industry here in Erie County, but we're not talking necessarily about brain surgeons and high-end eds and meds, as we call it in the academy and in government. Mm-hmm. But we're seeing a higher percentage of kind of low-wage health workers entering the workforce. And so we want to expand that sector as well to include some of those high-end eds and meds and the technology and research and development that I think would help not only contribute to that sector, but you'd see that begin to branch out and help us diversify that manufacturing sector as well.
Well, thanks for sharing that perspective and those statistics. And I can say anecdotally, I, for work, get to travel all around the country. You know, I've been to Denver a few times. I was just in Jupiter, Florida, the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And then coming back to Erie, there certainly is, just from a, visual comparison, like you can see the growth in those areas. But I'd never had anybody frame it up like, I almost feel like I'm, in a basketball game and I'm down 28-1, like you said, the U.S. versus the rest. What's holding Erie back? Why are we at the 1%? What are the things that are slowing us down?
Well, I think there's a lot of factors. We did not over time, and really, I mean, this goes back 50 years. We didn't really begin to diversify as large manufacturing was beginning to leave or close down, and we didn't really have other pathways to dig into, despite the fact that we are kind of geographically centered between three larger cities, and even you could count Toronto if you wanted to as the crow flies. And we didn't necessarily leverage all of those relationships, I think, as well as we could have over time. I think we're doing a better job of that now. We're doing a better job of looking outside of ourselves and kind of taking an external view of Erie and thinking about what the future of this community and what the future of Northwest Pennsylvania looks like, and who might want to be here to start a company. But I think because we've had such slow economic growth over the past 20 years, we've reached a point where it's hard for people to innovate here. It's hard for people to start businesses, and there's just not a whole lot of local investment capital for kind of major innovation and major industry. And so we're really counting on some of the industries that we have here to lead that charge and to help us diversify and to bring in some of those innovative components that are going to perhaps put us back on pace with both state and national growth.
And is there a mindset that also has to change in our area, in the Rust Belt, and just the fact that it used to be in Northwest PA, it was the GE and it was Hammermill. And so I can say my grandfather, he worked at Hammermill from the day he was done with high school all the way through graduation, and he had all the way through retirement, and he had 8 brothers who did the exact same things. All 9 of them worked at the Hammermill from the day they were done with high school through retirement. I mean, that's never going to happen again. And I think that's part of the mindset that folks have to understand is those days aren't coming back. We have to forge a new future.
Yeah, those days aren't coming back, and I think, but I think the economic landscape has changed. So even if those jobs existed, I don't know that people would stay in them as long as folks did in the past. I come from Reading, Pennsylvania, and we had very much the same legacy. Fathers and sons would work at Carpenter Steel, generation after generation, and spend their entire careers there. And maybe a generation ago, that began to change, and it was in part because of technology entering the workforce and the need for smaller labor forces but you also needed a more skilled labor force as well. And once you begin to acquire some of those skills and an understanding of that technology, it gives you more mobility than perhaps you had when you were just doing manual labor.
Okay, and so let's transition that to what does our next congressional representative need to do to boost the economic growth? So what do they need to do to ensure a strong economic future for our community? Is it based in, the skills that you mentioned, getting new skills training? What are some of the things that they need to do?
I think skills training is critical, and every outside consultant that comes in to talk to local government makes note of the fact that Erie has no community college. We have 4 institutions of higher ed, and that certainly is great, but they're not necessarily, their mission is not necessarily skills training, particularly for folks who would be moving more from kind of a high school to workforce pipeline. So I think the establishment of a community college is really, really hurting our ability to attract and retain business and attract and retain talent, because there's not a lot of places for people to be retrained at the moment. So our next congressman isn't going to necessarily have a role in that. That's a statewide decision, but I think the next congressman needs to lobby heavily, and I think as well as I do that Ron DiNicola has lobbied for that and led that initiative as a bipartisan initiative for the community. And so I think that's one piece of it. But we also need to have a really honest conversation about wages in this country and what that looks like. And I think that we need to have a congressional representative who recognizes what the actual cost of a low-wage economy and what the actual cost of those wages across our community are, and to talk about how we get folks a living wage. And I know everybody has kind of a different perspective on this, and whether we should move slowly or whether we should jump right in and push toward a $15 an hour minimum wage. And I'm not going to take a position on what that dollar figure should be, but the fact that we expect folks to be able to live off of a minimum wage that is just over $7 an hour is a little ridiculous. And everybody says, oh, well, those weren't intended to be career jobs, but the fact is that we have 18-year-olds who want to work and can't when they're coming out of high school or when they're going through college, because a lot of those minimum wage jobs are being absorbed by people in their mid-30s who are either between careers or just can't kind of find a path into a high-wage job. And so as a result, we've seen wages rise for those at the kind of the top of the economic distribution, but for those folks at the bottom and in the middle class, wages have been stagnant. And I think you see that. It's illustrated across our region, that stagnation in wage and people not being able to kind of reinvest in their own properties and reinvest in their communities in ways that you may have seen kind of post-World War II.
Great. And so for folks who may be driving while they're listening to this, you can't do the math, $8 an hour times 2,080 hours, which would be working 40 hours a week, every single week, not taking a day off, that doesn't even get you to $17,000 in gross pay, which, like I said, is difficult to do anything on. And oftentimes what folks have to do is pick up a second job, another one at $8 an hour. That's still not even getting them to 30, and they're not able to raise their family, and it just, has a whole a downward spiral effect. Now, we talked about this in the framework of what's the next congressional rep going to do. The current one, Mike Kelly, seems like his big economic boost is where he talks about tax cuts. But the recent tax cuts that were passed by the House ended up giving millions to the rich and corporations, and they might have thrown a bone to some middle-class citizens, and you really didn't address much the folks on the lower end of that wage scale. So the tax cuts haven't boosted our local economy, and they didn't benefit workers. What, Jim, from your perspective, would be a better strategy to boost the economy in our area? What would help get those wages up?
Well, I think having some federal support and reinvestment in our infrastructure would be a major first step. I happen to be of the belief that the federal government does have a role to play in job creation, and that we know that our country's infrastructure is old and in many cases failing. I think that's one way that the government and Congress can lead that charge. But I also think that they could do a significant service to the community and to wage employees who are carrying a lot of college debt. I don't know if you were unfortunate enough as I was to carry student loan debt, but when you think about the monthly payment that goes into student loan debt, and what you could do with that and how you could reinvest that in yourself and your family. And if you're only making $13-14 an hour with a college degree, it's going to be difficult to do that, to reinvest in yourself and in your family in the ways that perhaps you want to. So I think in order to kind of uplift the local economy and local economies across the country, Congress is going to have to address student loan debt before too long. But I'd also like to add that as a whole, the Rust Belt is a pretty dynamic economy. I mean, we call it the Rust Belt, and others are renaming it and rebranding it. I've seen it as the Trust Belt and other things, and that's all great. But we still have that industrial legacy that we're dealing with. But nevertheless, the economy across the Rust Belt states is pretty robust. Someone told me the other day that the combined economic impact of the Rust Belt states together makes us the third largest economy in the world. And that's pretty significant when you think about it. And that should be pretty significant in terms of legislative power as well. When you can get those folks in Congress who represent the Rust Belt regions together, they should be a force. And they need to be able to leverage that as well, whether we're talking about shipping, whether we're talking about resources for the Army Corps of Engineers, whether we're talking about infrastructure for logistics, whether that be our highways or our rail systems. They need to be thinking about how they use that power to help the regions rebuild. And you're seeing it in some places, and you're seeing a significant new economy in and around Cleveland, seeing a significant new economy in and around Buffalo, and those are larger cities, but I think Congress has a role to play in helping some of the smaller cities do that as well, and some of the rural regions uplift over time. And I think once you begin to do that, you begin to see a more comprehensive economy, and you begin to build regions and communities where outside companies and outside interests then want to come and invest.
Great, thank you for that info. And I guess to segue into my next topic, you were talking about infrastructure. It seems like the White House was always trying to have Infrastructure Week, and it got blown up by some crazy tweet. But certainly Infrastructure Week hasn't impacted, PA 16. Haven't seen that at all. But then you bring up about the student loans, and so that doesn't pertain necessarily to you and to me because we're older at this point. But I guess it just shows that what you're talking about is the next congressional rep needs to think about the folks that maybe they haven't walked a mile in their shoes where they don't have that debt anymore, but those students do, and they have to think about that. And so I guess to transfer that to show empathy for other people. So in other episodes of this podcast, I'm talking to women about women issues, but it shouldn't only be women defending women's rights and men just, don't say anything about it. I think men have to speak up as well. What are you seeing as some of the key issues? What are you hearing from women in our community as their biggest challenges, and what should our next congressional representative do to address those challenges for women?
Well, I think across the board, when you talk to women across the district and really anywhere, I mean, the issues that they're concerned about are the same issues that we're all talking about, whether that be fair wages, and certainly there's an inequity, although wages have grown for women a bit in the last few years. It's still not an equal playing field. Women, there's still a kind of an ideological, I guess, thought that women are still kind of the primary caregivers in the home, and so that makes them a greater liability in the workplace, and we know that that's not true. And so they have kind of like this sociological stereotypes to overcome, but I think from a policy perspective, the biggest issue that women are concerned about is healthcare. We saw this in the fight over the contraception mandate, and women both want and deserve control over their own physical destiny, the ability to be able to make choices about their bodies and about how that affects their ability to either start families or become wage earners, or perhaps be the breadwinners, or to be simply independent of anyone and anything else. And that independence is something that men have enjoyed, we might say, for all time. And,
sure. And
I think women deserve to have that as well. Certainly, nobody is trying to legislate what men do with their body,
right?
And yet we continually go back and want to kind of create a moral argument about what women should be doing, and it's not a moral argument at all to be made. It's really an economic one, and one that allows women to be to have access to economic independence and to not have to worry from day to day or month to month. But I say that as someone who did for a period of time stay home and take care of my first daughter when she was born, and then my wife in turn carried the burden of the household while I was finishing up graduate school and going through the process of tenure and promotion at the university, which is rigorous and time consuming, and so we understand that, and I don't pretend to know what it's like to be a woman in America, and I think that it's important for myself and for others when they're out in the community and they're talking about these issues to also listen, because women are speaking loudly, perhaps more loudly now than ever, and they need and deserve to be heard. And I think you're seeing that now, and you're going to see that particularly as the Supreme Court begins to put its toe back in the water surrounding Roe versus Wade, and as a nation, as we need to confront kind of some public health realities when it comes to legislation that concerns women in particular.
Yeah, let's see if we can confront that reality right now, and I don't want to dance around the issue of abortion when talking about women's rights. And so I'm Catholic, like a lot of other people in our area and in our congressional district. I attended a small Christian school here in Erie for high school, and many people in those communities always vote pro-life. Like nothing else matters. If the person's pro-life, they're pro-life. I remember when Hortensia Keller was running for Erie City Treasurer, she was on a local radio talk show, and somebody called in to say, "Are you pro-life?" And she's like, "I'm running for treasurer. Like, what difference does that make?" And they're like, "I'm only voting for people who are pro-life." So, can you talk about, Jim, why are you pro-choice? And then I'm really interested to get an answer to this question for us to have this discussion, because nobody asks and talks about it. What would America look like if abortion was made illegal in America? Like, what would be those actual ramifications? Would that mean there's no abortions and life would be happy, or what would it be? I guess, can you address that abortion question head on?
Well, I would say that I'm pro-choice just because I believe in people's right to be able to choose and to make those decisions. I don't believe that for women to have access to contraception and abortion means that people are more cavalier in their behaviors or with their bodies. And so I think that people make these choices for a lot of reasons. And if you limit that choice, you're also potentially putting women at harm. I mean, there are a lot of medical situations where abortion is necessary, and if it's legislated away, now you're putting someone else's life at harm. I don't know. I have a hard time wrestling with the quote unquote pro-life discussion because there seems to be a lot of hypocrisy embedded in it. And so I guess I understand it from a religious perspective, but from an actual practical day-to-day staring someone in the eye, for them not to have that option when it might save their life is to me
right. Like an example, I was reading up on this recently, and so I'm a cancer survivor. I had colon cancer, had to have surgery, went through chemo, and I always say I had the junior varsity version of chemotherapy. My hair didn't fall out, and I gained weight, so I didn't have it anywhere close as tough to most people in there. But reading a story about somebody who got pregnant and then was diagnosed with cancer and had to get chemo, but I'm trying to think what the situation was in terms of, well, they weren't able to get it because they'd have to have an abortion first. And then you go, oh, yeah, what do you do in situations like that? Again, I don't have all the answers, but I don't know if we've thought those things all the way through.
I don't know that I don't certainly have those answers either, but again, that's where that should be a decision that person makes with their doctor about what's best for them. And I think there are a lot of reasons why someone would want to terminate a pregnancy or need to terminate a pregnancy, and we can't account for all of those contingencies in a piece of legislation that's going to tell people what's right and what is wrong. So I think everybody has the ability to educate others, to talk about issues that are important to them. And if you feel strongly, if you're strongly anti-choice, then you need to be able to articulate why that is, and try to bring people to your side, just as the folks that are pro-choice should be able to do as well. But for me, it simply comes down to that independence and the ability for somebody to make that decision for themselves. I don't ever want to find myself in a medical situation where I'm not able to make a choice that's important for me, and I don't think that it's fair for someone to limit that option for women either.
Yeah, and some of the reality is, I mean, there's a book that I read, I think it's called Everybody Lies, and it talks about how you can learn a lot about people based on their anonymous Google searches. And so for self-induced abortions, that search is most popular like in places like Mississippi, in areas that really restrict it. And so it seems like the reality is, and this has been played out in some other countries, I think like El Salvador and Chile, that have abortion is illegal, where wealthy people will go and get the procedure, they're able to afford it, pay somebody to do that in a safe manner, but people who don't have the financial means just end up finding some drugs that make them bleed out, and so that terminates the abortion. But then a lot of those folks end up with longer-term medical situations. I guess I don't know if anybody ever talks about that end of it, like that's a reality of it seems like what's going to happen.
I mean, we had a period in this country. In fact, pretty much from the inception of this country until Roe versus Wade. We had a period where abortion was illegal, I guess, in most cases, and people find a way to do what they feel they need to do, and whether you feel like that's morally right or morally wrong, I don't think that as a third party, you get to make that distinction for someone else. And if they really feel like they need to do that for whatever reason, they're going to find a way to do it. I would argue that it's better for the public health of the nation for them to be able to do that in a safe and healthy way.
Yeah, and I feel icky. I feel uncomfortable talking about it. But like you said, a lot of times you just think to yourself, okay, if my wife or my daughter had to make a medical decision, do you want the government telling you what you can do and what you can't do, or do you want that to be a family decision and then between the doctors? So, well, thank you for being brave enough to answer that question.
Sure.
So we have just a few minutes left, 2 more questions for you. So one, I'm hoping we can tie together economics and women's rights by talking about the gender pay gap. So I've seen studies that say women make between 77 and 82 cents a dollar, for every dollar that a man makes. Yet when legislation related to this has been brought to the House floor, our current Rep. Mike Kelly opposes it. So, for example, there is the Paycheck Fairness Act. So it's designed to strengthen the penalties courts can impose for pay discrimination. It also forbids retaliation against workers that inquire or disclose information about an employer's wage practices. Yet Mike Kelly, for some reason, thought that was a bad idea. And I can say there's real stuff that goes on. I published a hiring book 6 years ago. I spoke to a local group. I won't say who the group is or where it was, but it was retired executives, and I gave my presentation about hiring best practices. The first question asked was, what question do you ask that you don't get detected to find out if a woman's going to have a baby so you don't end up hiring her? And I'm like, are you putting me on? Like, really? And they was like, no, dead serious.
Yeah.
Like, I want to know that. So that's the reality. So I guess, Jim, how can it be 2018 and we're still discussing pay inequality for women? How is that possible?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how we got here or how we get out of it without somebody mandating it, and it's a critical mandate. Women are gaining ground. There was a recent study by Brookings talking about wage growth that shows that across the country, women of all races are seeing higher wage growth and wage growth at a higher rate than men. But that only gets us to that 82 cents for every dollar that a man makes. So that's still critically problematic. And I think we've reached a point in this country where men, where they have the option, are taking paternity leave almost as regularly as women are taking maternity leave, and so is it really a fair question to even wonder about in a hiring practice whether or not somebody is going to take a break to go raise their family? And while we're on that topic, we should talk about the fact that it's pretty gross that in a nation like ours that we only give women a few weeks to stay at home with their child before they're forced back into the workforce, and limited in the amount of time that they're able to spend with that new human being. They're barely getting a chance to know that child and to understand who that individual is that's now going to reside in their house for the better part of the next 20 years. And then they have to turn around and go to work so that they can take a majority of their paycheck and put it back into childcare. It's really kind of a vexing system that we have in place here in this country. And so, there are a lot of families who are choosing to stay for one or the other member, one parent or the other, to stay at home because it makes economic sense for them to do so. So I think if companies were more forward-thinking about how they deal with maternity, I don't think that the question of whether or not someone left to have a child would really be be one that was all that impactful to the company itself, right? People have the ability to work remotely. If they're away from the office longer, that doesn't mean that they're not working. In fact, there are a lot of studies that show that when people are kind of fluid with the office, in and out of the office, they're actually quite a bit more productive than when they're chained to their cubicle all day. And I realize I'm kind of getting off on a tangent from your original question, but I think it's all tied together. And I think once we get to a place where we're thinking more holistically about people and their families and their work-life balance and how those things can ultimately benefit a company, then it becomes less of a question about gender, right? It levels that playing field. And there are companies that make efforts to do that, but whether that's by bringing childcare into the company or whether it's by giving people the flexibility to kind of have that work-life balance. And I think that kind of conversation and those kind of moves by larger firms will ultimately help lead that conversation. But I would love to see a public official lead that conversation and go out and force a true equal rights amendment that is going to balance both the wage gap and the opportunity gap for women in this country.
Right. It would be refreshing to have that kind of leadership as opposed to, a lot of the junk that we're hearing just coming out, just cheering different things that don't really impact us here in PA 16. So, Jim, last question for you, because I always want to talk about moral leadership, ethical leadership, and let's talk about that through the lens of the topics we've discussed, economics and women's issues. So our next congressional rep is going to be a congressman, right? Whether it's Mike Kelly or Ron DiNicola, they're going to be a guy, and they're not going to be poor, right? They don't have to worry about their income, and their health care choices aren't limited. But it seems like, don't they have still a moral obligation to speak up on behalf of those groups and to understand those groups and to push for legislation for those groups, even though they're not a member of either one? Like, true leadership is putting the interests of those you serve above your own self-interest, above your next re-election campaign. Like, isn't that a main thing that we need to think about as well and hold our elected officials to account for?
I think so, and I think they should expect to be held accounted for. I would like to back up and point out that the only Democrat that's been elected to Congress from this district since 1983 was a woman. So we do have that. Kathy Dahlkemper. So we do have that going for us, and I think I think Kathy is a great advocate for women throughout the community and women in politics and women in power, and I think she's a great example. On the other side, when we're talking about special interests versus the interests of your constituents, I think there's a real divide, and I'm going to be a little more political maybe than we've been throughout the conversation. But I think when you look at someone like Mike Kelly, who spends very little time in Erie County in particular, but not as much time in really all of the northern part of the district in northwest Pennsylvania as he does in Butler, I think that's problematic. I don't think he really gets a sense of who his constituents are. I also think that he doesn't have to worry about that burden much because so much of his campaign fundraising comes from special interests. He has something like $1.7 million in his campaign fund, and $1.2 or $1.3 million has come from special interests. And so I think you can kind of see where his loyalties are. And when you have a candidate like Ron DiNicola, I think he has a track record of working on behalf of others. He has a track record of going out, whether it was on pre-K for PA, helping to lead that bipartisan effort, whether it was the initiative to get the community college in Erie, and we're still waiting on a decision from the PA Department of Education on that, or whether it was kind of working to help reestablish the police athletic league, because he understands that you really got to kind of help those folks in between kindergarten and college as well. So I think he has a real understanding about who those constituents are, and who the people in this community and in this region are, and I think that will benefit him throughout this process, and I think it would make him a really sound legislator in Washington as well.
Well, Jim, that's all the time that we have, but I want to thank you for giving us a better perspective of the constituents that the next congressional rep will be serving here in Northwest PA and throughout all of Western Pennsylvania. So I appreciate your time today and the volunteer work that you do to help better people's lives.
Thank you.
Our podcast is over, but there's still more that we need to do. As we talked about at the start, for democracy to work, we can't be bystanders. We have to participate. You can help by sharing this episode with your family and at least one or two on-the-fence voters who live in our district, and then by voting on Election Day. Let's surprise the special interest groups, the political action committees, and the big money when we take back our district Tuesday, November 6th, and once again, put people first. I'm Jim Roddy. Thanks so much for listening to October Surprise.